Good morning or good afternoon or good evening, wherever you are in the world. Talent Finders would like to welcome Jared Bradley, forensic DNA collection expert. Jared helped investigate to solve crimes using the MVAC wet vacuum for forensic DNA collection system, and host of all things crime, CSI, detective DNA, analyst, FBI, tested, and so much more. So welcome, Jared.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Firstly, I'd like to congratulate you on all your achievements. Can you share with us how and what motivated you to pursue a career in the development of technology and assisting and improving and working with various law enforcement departments?
I'd love to. I appreciate the opportunity. You know, I fell into the forensics DNA collection market mostly by accident, and partly because in 2006, my father, Dr. Bruce Bradley, had developed the MVAC, and it was originally developed for collecting E. coli and Salmonella and food adulterants, and even anthrax on the biowarfare side.
Wow.
And I've had a number of careers. My first was in the military, straight out of college. I joined the U.S. Army. And then after a little stint there, I had a number of different sales jobs, including, and I ended up with Pfizer Pharmaceutical, and I was there for about 7 years. And I kind of realized that that industry was headed in a direction that I wasn't really too excited about, I guess, is how I would put it.
Yeah.
And right about then is when my dad was ready to launch the MVAC into the food safety market. So we were having a conversation. He asked me to come on, and I was more than happy to do so. And so initially we were marketing the MVAC to different food companies, showing them how it could collect more E. coli or more other bacteria and things like that, hopefully to make the food safer. That was our whole goal. But what we realized is that the MVAC collects so much more than the other methods that it would completely throw off all of their calculations, if you will. And so around 2010, we really started recognizing that no matter what we did, they just weren't going to use our system. And so we started looking for different markets. And right around then is when I ran into an old college buddy of mine who had gone into the FBI at the same time that I was in the military. And he was, in listening what the MVAC was in the food safety context, he thought, wow, something like that would have been amazing on some of the crime scenes that he had processed.
Yeah.
And so that's when we got the idea of taking it and possibly collecting forensics DNA. And in 2012, that's how we pivoted into the forensics market, and that's where we've been ever since.
Wow, that's amazing. So you help investigators solve crimes, obviously using the MVAC. So can you share with us more about what the MVAC is and how it has really improved and helped other investigators or people within the crime investigation divisions?
Sure. Well, if anybody has ever operated a carpet cleaner, you know the basics of how it works. So it sprays a sterile solution down and then vacuums up whatever's there. And so when you think about DNA, especially like imagine grabbing a cup or something more porous, a rock or a brick. Let's just take a rock. If you grab a rock with your hand, you are leaving a significant amount of DNA on that rock.
Yeah.
And the more rough and sharp edges and things like that a rock might have, the more DNA you're going to leave. But the DNA is going to fall down into the little cracks and crevices of that surface, of the surface of the rock. And so if you can think of, now imagine a skin cell is so small that you can't see it with just your eyes. And so the cracks and crevices of a rock might be small to us or almost non-existent to us, but to a skin cell, it's like the Grand Canyon. So there's plenty of areas that it's going to fall into. And by doing that, it becomes inaccessible to most of the other methods. So the kind of the standard that has always been around is called a swab. And
Yes.
basically it's a Q-tip. So a Q-tip physically, it can't defy the laws of physics, but it physically can't get down into those little cracks and crevices where the majority of the DNA from your hand is going to reside.
Yes.
But the MVAC can't, because again, the spray goes down into there and then the vacuum pressure sucks it all out.
Wow.
And so whatever skin cells are going to be on that rock that the swab couldn't access, the MVAC can. Now, it's never going to pull up 100%, but it's going to pull up the vast majority. And many times that's the difference between a good profile or a partial or a non-existent profile.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's fascinating. So over the many years that you have dedicated within this very niche focus within law enforcement and the CSI, obviously with the MVAC, you must have seen some amazing breakthroughs in technology that has aided investigators in their case. So can you share with us more about this and how this has helped be more accurate in catching the perpetrators of such crimes?
Oh, sure. Yeah, the number of technologies, not just in DNA, but in investigative technologies in general,
yes.
Over the past, 10, 15 years has just skyrocketed. And it's really amazing the tools that are available now. Not every agency has every tool, of course, but the ones that can afford certain technologies, and it seems like every year they set aside a certain amount of money to buy certain technologies. And that's just the nature of the game. But
yes.
There are technologies such as, well, let's just stick with DNA first. Obviously, the MVAC is on the front end, but in the middle, where is mostly lab processing, they've been able to go from, like say in the late 90s, you needed a blood spot, for example, about the size, I don't know if you can see that, about a silver dollar, if you can think of that, or a 50-cent piece, if you're familiar with old coins in the US.
Yes.
But imagine a really large coin. That's the size of the blood spot you needed to give just the basic information.
Yes.
Well, now that is advanced so far that it's not just the head of a pin, it's the tip of a pin.
Wow.
of cells on there. So you go from needing millions and millions of cells to down to 10, 15, 20 cells. You can produce not just the basic information that the old technology could produce, but now you can actually differentiate between billions, if not trillions of people. And
yes.
You can say with almost 100% certainty that, yes, this profile belongs to Jared, or yes, this profile belongs to Susan. And they can never say with 100% certainty, but it's like one chance in a trillion that it's not Jared, if that makes sense. So yeah, it's pretty amazing, but that's just on the DNA side. Now you've also got technology that, for example, they can put in the middle of a room or in the middle of a car crash scene or something like that. And the camera will spin and it'll give a 360-degree 3D version of what the crime scene looked like.
Wow. That's
all
amazing.
The furniture. Yeah, it's some of these technologies are absolutely incredible. And all of this has been developed so that not only the investigator is more efficient, but also if they're actually in court, they can show these images up on the screen and the jury can see them and say, oh, okay, now I understand exactly where the couch was, exactly where the body was laying, those kind of things. And it gives everybody a better sense of what actually happened.
Yes.
So, and that's just two examples of, well, let me go with one more that's kind of near and dear to my heart because it's in DNA. And yes. That is so there's getting a DNA profile is actually a 3-step process. So obviously there's lots of little mini steps in there, but the 3 major steps. One is on the front end, that's the collection end. The processing is during the crime lab, and that's when they take the raw material, like the skin cells of the blood or the saliva, and they actually break it down to the DNA strand level, and then develop it into actually being able to read it. And then there's the deciphering step, and that is when they actually compare it with other profiles and sense the strength of it, that kind of thing. It's the recognition on the end. Well, there's been technologies developed, and they're kind of algorithm based, where you used to have to be able to have almost an exact match. Well, now you can input this, whatever signature your cells give and your DNA produces, the algorithm can pipe it in there and basically separate multiple, like, for example, if you were to sample or collect from some kind of a public space, more than likely you're going to have, it's not just going to be your DNA that they're going to collect. They're going to collect lots of different people. Now, there's a limit to how many you can do, but let's say there's 5 people in that sample. Well, this algorithm on the end, and this technology and the software on the end, can actually separate all those 5 and determine who's contributed what percent of the DNA that's there, and it can actually assign it to the 5 different people. So
wow, that's amazing.
Right. And what used to take a person hours and hours to do, this software can do it in a matter of seconds. So
wow.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So what would you say some of your biggest lessons and learnings have been within your career?
Within my career, wow.
And I'm sure there've been multiple, but like, what really stands out for you?
Well, between all of them, I think the military, as well as the numerous sales jobs that I've had, even management and leadership, I would say that the number one thing that I have learned is that discipline and hard work overcomes everything. So it doesn't matter really what kind of circumstance you're in. If you maintain a positive attitude, you look at what you want to accomplish as opposed to what you're going through, eventually you'll get through it. And if you maintain that hard work and that positive attitude about whatever it is you're doing and whatever your goals are, then ultimately you'll come out on the other side better than where you currently are.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I have so much respect for those in law enforcement. I mean, I know like you're not directly, working on that side every day, but especially in the CSI departments, what are some of the notions you'd like to dispel about CSI and investigation? Because obviously a lot of people watch fictional TV shows. How far is this from the truth in terms of what's portrayed in series like CSI and all of that, which obviously is insightful, but is there a lot of truth to it, or is, what would you like to dispel about that versus reality?
Yeah, where do I start? The interesting thing about CSI, I actually, in 2013, I actually went down to Universal Studios in California and visited the CSI set.
Wow.
And yeah, it was pretty amazing. It was fun. And the amount of resources and well, just the huge building that they used to shoot that was incredible. But it was amazing because there's one set that's a permanent set that is always set up, and one room will kind of blend into another room, but based on the camera angles and things, they can just make it look like it's in a completely different spot. But that aside, the cool thing about the CSI set was they actually had, like in their DNA lab, all of that equipment was real.
Wow.
Had they actually had trained people, they could have probably produced DNA profiles. So pretty amazing that they had all of that, and it was mostly just used as a prop. And in one episode, they used the MVAC.
Wow. That must have been quite an honor.
Yeah, it was. It was fun seeing it on there. Of course, they used it wrong, but
yes.
that's just got,
But most people wouldn't know that because they're not in it, though.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. And my biggest regret about that is I didn't have MVAC systems plastered on the side of the machine so that people actually knew what it was. But yeah, that was when we first got started, and we actually expected them to do it. And clearly they're not going to. But the whole reason I bring that up is because CSI is based on 43 minutes of airtime. And that includes showing the crime, showing the investigation, showing the, like how they produce a DNA or a fingerprint profile or whatever, and then actually solving it and then arresting the perpetrators at the end. And they have to cram all of that in 43 minutes. And so the biggest problem with these crime shows, as cool as they are and as dramatic as they are and entertaining as they are, there's a literal thing called the CSI effect. And what the CSI effect is, they're finding that in juries and in literal cases, they'll go in front of these juries and they have to completely re-educate the jury on what the process is, because they have this notion that the crimes actually can be solved in 43 minutes. And it's just not reality.
No.
For example, in many labs, especially the public labs, they're so backlogged with cases and they have so high volume of cases that it may take 8 months, a year to actually get DNA results back. Now on the show, of course, it takes 10 minutes. And that's just, so really dealing with adult timeframes and how things actually occur. I think that's the biggest thing that they need to dispel, is just this kind of notion that things happen immediately, that everybody cooperates with the police, those kind of things, because that's just not reality.
Yeah, for sure. So you've obviously seen and heard so much within your career, and having developed the MVAC, are there other technologies and tools you will be developing to help investigators with their cases, or is it just strictly the MVAC that's your core focus?
Well, the MVAC is our core purpose. We work with a lot of the other companies that have these other technologies because oftentimes the MVAC actually works synergistically with them. And so in understanding that and understanding these other technologies, it's important for me to, especially when I'm doing trainings and things like that, to understand what technologies certain labs or certain agencies might have and be able to understand what those technologies will do. So I don't actually market with them, but there are times that because we work synergistically and we can enhance each other's capabilities, that we will maybe, for example, there's we'll just take an agency, NYPD. Everybody knows NYPD. Let's say NYPD is fielding a certain technology in their crime lab, but also even let's say an ALS, which is an alternative light source. That's the light that they can shine down on surfaces, and different spectrums give different resonance, and they can see, for example, I can't remember exactly what it is, but a blue light while you're wearing orange glasses will make saliva pop out. So they can see saliva much better with a combination of these certain colors. And blood's a different way, and semen's a different way. And so let's say they're fielding this ALS. Well, once they do that, maybe you'll be able to see the DNA that the MVAC might be collecting. And so by understanding these two technologies and how they can work synergistically, then I can be more of a benefit to that agency, and I can help them in their training, both not just with the MVAC, but also with this ALS. So if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, 100%, because it all interlinks at the end of the day. So
right.
100%. So what would you say some of your biggest career highlights have been?
Biggest career highlights, specifically with MVAC systems, or
Yeah,
or
or
in
in
general?
general, within your career, if there's, there may be multiple that stand out for you in the different fields that you worked in at different times.
Sure. Well, with the military, obviously getting promoted to different ranks was important. I ended my military career as a captain in the Army, but I was able to go through Ranger School and airborne school and different things like that, and those were tough, and always it's always fun to be able to look back and say, yeah, I accomplished that. But as far as actual career things that have been the most rewarding to me, by
Yes.
far, it's been in the forensics industry, because prior to getting involved with MVAC systems, and then most importantly, once we pivoted into forensics, I had no idea how gratifying it would be to have a detective call me and say, hey, Jared, you're not going to believe this, but we just solved a 30-year-old cold case using your machine.
Wow, that's
And
incredible.
yeah, the best one, or the oldest one, I should say, is 56 years. So there was a cold case in New York, in Albany, New York, that had been a cold case for 56 years.
Wow.
And just this last year, they were able to solve it because they used the MVAC on, I think it was a shirt, and developed a DNA profile that they couldn't develop before. And so, yeah, getting that phone call and reading about it in the news and understanding that it was our technology that actually helped solve that case, that it's just absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, that is amazing. So you've had a very diverse career. You have extensive background in leadership, science, operations, and marketing. So can you share with us more about this?
Sure. Well, obviously, when you get into any kind of military position, you're not there in a following type of a position very long.
Yeah.
Once you've been in the military, your ability to become a leader is kind of forced on you, if you will.
Yes.
But I also went through ROTC, and so I went into leadership by choice. And being able to help people along with their own career, that's always been satisfying for me, and also serving my country. I don't think there's anything really that's much more fulfilling than that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and I know that the police agencies that I work with now, law enforcement officers, that's why they get into what they do. They certainly don't do it for the money. So they want to serve their community, and that's the way that they've chosen to do it. And so being able to help them has also been very fulfilling, because there's some that get into law enforcement and then realize that's not something that they want to stay in for 20, 30 years. And so after whatever, 5, 6, 10 years, they'll get out. And some of them have asked me what kind of advice I had for them to transition out of there. And that's been fulfilling.
Yes.
But as far as just all my different careers in general, it's really been one of those things that if you look at the day-to-day tasks, it doesn't matter what you're doing. They can be menial and sometimes appear trivial. But in the end, when you look back on them, there's always lessons learned. And I just think that what I am today, in part, is because of all the different areas that I've chosen as careers. And ultimately, everybody finds what they were meant to do. And I think regardless of what stage in life they're at, as long as they don't just completely resist any kind of change, then eventually they'll find what they want to do. And that's really what happened with me.
Yes.
When I left college, I was going to be a military guy. I was going to be a 20, 30-year military guy. My goal was to be a full bird colonel. But once I got into it, I realized pretty quickly that it's not really conducive to family life, and my wife hated it. So,
Yeah, it's not easy,
yeah,
especially if you're married or you have a family.
right.
A lot of
Yeah,
sacrifice from both
oh, it's
sides.
incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
The sacrifice that active duty military personnel do, and the sacrifice that they make is absolutely incredible. And I just realized fairly quickly that it just wasn't going to work for me. And so after just 3 years of active duty, I transitioned out. And, you know, I've always missed it. And there's regret somewheres in there, but had I not transitioned out, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today. And so,
Exactly. And also you are still making a difference. You're just doing it in a different way. And, you know, you're helping for the betterment of humanity. So for sure.
yeah, I appreciate that. That's one of the reasons that I did it. So,
Yeah. So you spent 14 years working on the MVAC system, including 10 years. Well, you still are the president. So can you share with us more about the motivation for developing the MVAC and how this helped in the field of forensics? So you obviously have highlighted that, but, you know, if you could just explain sort of what your motivation was behind that.
Sure. So my dad actually invented the MVAC, and he grew up on a ranch in Idaho, first of all. And so he grew up around the beef industry his entire life. And he had a, he had a PhD in animal sciences and microbiology. And so I don't know if you remember in 1993, especially on the West Coast of the US, there was an E. coli outbreak with hamburgers there.
Oh, yeah, I remember.
Yeah, with Jack in the Box.
Yes.
And I think it killed like 6 children and put about 140 people in the hospital with like permanent kidney issues. And it was really bad. But it was basically the first massive E. coli outbreak ever really honed in on. And I can't tell you how much that bothered my dad. He, especially as a man that, again, grew up on a ranch, knowing that beef had killed 6 kids. And that was right about the same time that his first grandchild was born. And so it really meant a lot to him. He's like, you know, what if that had been my granddaughter that had been killed by this E. coli? And there was something that I could have done to help solve that. So that got the wheels moving. And he, as a scientist, anytime a scientist is given a problem, they just have this unique ability to sit there and just think about it and eventually come up with a solution. And that's what he did.
Yeah.
He realized that if you're going to detect E. coli on a beef carcass, and you can imagine how big a beef carcass is.
Yes,
and the beef industry, yeah. So where is the E. coli on that entire surface? And it's equivalent, really, if you have a good size office, for example, say it's 10,000 square feet in your office, and there's a dime hidden somewhere in that office, and you've got 4 chances to try to find it. What are the chances that you're actually going to find it? And it's very, very low.
Yes.
And so that's kind of the same concept of sampling on a beef carcass. You have to cover a larger area and be able to get deeper in order to actually have any kind of statistical chance of getting it.
Yes.
And so once he realized that, then the next question was, well, how do you do it? And that's when he kind of came up with the concept of the MVAC, where it sprays the solution and vacuums it up just like a carpet cleaner would. So
yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of how the MVAC came about. It took my dad about 10 years of developing it because he was doing it at night after his work was done.
Yes.
And so he eventually got some grants from the NIH and started developing it full time. And around 2002, had enough funding that he could devote full time to it. And by 2007, we had a commercialized product and we're able to launch it. So that's kind of a brief history of how the MVAC came about. And yeah, we worked with the food industry until from 2007 to 2012, so about 5 years. And then once we realized that the forensics market was much more receptive, let's say,
Yes.
that's when we pivoted into forensics, and that's where we've been ever since.
Amazing. What a great story.
Well, thank you.
I want to talk about leadership, or the lack of leadership, on both the national and global scale. So what do you believe makes your leadership style different? And can you give us some examples? And what do you believe needs to change, or needs to happen to change and improve the current narrative?
So you're asking me to solve the world's problems today.
Well, I'm just saying from a leadership perspective, from where you've come from as a leader, and what makes you different, and what do you think needs to change, because there's such a lack of leadership. And I don't want to get political here, so
right.
But I just think on a global scale, and there's a lot of things that need to change. So what do you feel that needs to be?
Sure. Well, I think the biggest thing about leadership is communication. And not just your ability to talk and your ability to yell the way some people do,
yeah,
but to be able to actually communicate what your ideas are, and then listen. A big part of communication is listening. And
yes.
There's an old saying that says, God gave you one mouth and two ears for a reason. And that means that you should be listening twice as much as you're talking. And there's another thing that says, if you're talking, you're not learning anything.
Very true.
Because all you're doing is spewing out what's already in your brain. But if you're actually listening, then you can hear what the other person has to say. And it's easier said than done, of course. But
it's not a natural thing for everybody.
Oh, absolutely right on that. Everybody wants to get their point of view out, because obviously they believe that's the point of view that is correct and what really matters. But anybody that's ever been responsible for other people, whether it's a management or leadership role, understands that for the most part, it's a volunteer army. And the people that work for you, or the people that you're trying to negotiate a contract with, or the people that you're working with on the political sense, it doesn't really matter. It's all the same thing.
Yes.
And
it's just different environments.
Exactly. But humans are humans, and we all have the same tendencies. We all have the same goals. We all want to be successful. We all want to be taken care of, meaning, our shelter and food. And, once the basics are taken care of, then we all want to be entertained. We all want to have a fulfilling life. We all want to have relationships. Everybody's the same. It's just everybody comes from a different place, and we all have different diversities and experiences and things like that. And so until you actually understand the person that you're sitting across from, you'll never be able to actually understand how your position can actually benefit that person, and in turn benefit you. And so I just think it's such an interesting environment that we're in right now. And it doesn't matter if it's business or politics or anything else. I've traveled to many places in the world, as I know you have.
Yeah.
And it's so amazing when you go to a different place. And
it opens up your mind so much.
Right. And yet it's like the other place, wherever you're traveling to, like, for example, my most recent trip was actually almost a year ago now. And I went to Thailand and Myanmar, and pretty much everybody there looked different than me. And obviously the people in Thailand, how they live is going to be much different than how I live here in the United States.
Yes.
But as an American, the last thing I wanted to do was to ever criticize how they were living, because that's not my place.
No,
it's not my place to tell the UK how they're supposed to be living, or what their policies are, or anything really. And so my goal was to go there, experience them, experience how they're doing, and actually enjoy it. And
yes,
I think
what it is.
Right. And I think interacting with other people is the same way. It's like,
yes.
you know, I'm guilty of being opinionated, probably much more so than what I should ever be. But at the same time, I've also been around long enough that I know that my opinion is exactly that. And there's times when interacting with other people, and including in business, including in even with the MVAC, when I look at some agencies or some, like a crime scene investigator, and we just are not connecting, I just say, you know what, maybe this just isn't a good fit. And that's fine. That's fine. They have their opinions. I have my opinions. And somewhere, if at some junction, you're just going like this and you're just not getting along, then, you know, both of us should be mature enough and adult enough that we just kind of stand back and say, hey, you know what, let's revisit this later.
Yes. Sometimes it's just about the timing as well.
Right. Yeah. There's been, let's see, over the last 8 years that I've been selling the MVAC into the forensics market, there have been multiple agencies and particular people within those agencies that initially, when I first contacted them, we did not hit it off well. I've even had the phone hung up on me a couple of times. Can you believe that? But eventually, you know what? Things change, circumstances change, relationships change. And so as they do, you can come full circle and revisit things. But just understanding that possibility exists. You don't have to get along with everybody exactly at that moment. And most importantly, everybody doesn't have to agree with you at that moment. And the more we realize that and recognize that and adopt that, I think the better off everybody would be.
Absolutely. So you've also had the opportunity to teach all over the world about the MVAC, the wet vacuum. Can you share with us more about this, and what were some of the lessons and insights you learned from teaching and working in other environments or other countries?
Yeah, boy, I've had some just absolutely fantastic experiences. Just a few that jump out is Singapore, Iceland. There's other areas that I've been to. And the one thing that has been satisfying, as well as, how do I even put it here? I don't know, almost, I'm not really sure how to put it, but there's a consistency in law enforcement around the world. It doesn't matter really where I am. Everybody's goal is the same, and that is to bring justice to the victim.
Yeah.
And the victim, I think, is the one area that all of law enforcement is focused on. And there is there's always going to be the outliers. Again, I was doing an interview right before I came on with you. And the interesting thing is, in our discussion there, the George Floyd in Minneapolis, that scenario came up.
Yeah.
Those kind of scenarios, fortunately, extremely fortunately, are so few and far between that it's one of those that, and society couldn't survive if those were common appearances or, common occurrences. So, but it doesn't really matter anywhere that I go, anywhere in the world. Everybody that is involved with the investigative process, they all have the same goal in mind, and that is to find the truth and to try to make the victims as whole as possible. And the victim of, when you think of like a murder victim, for example, a murder victim is not just the victim. You also have the victims are also the whoever was murdered, their family.
Yeah, of course.
Their community, the law enforcement that has to be investigating it, they're affected by it. Let me give you an example. There was a detective in Seattle that I was talking to on one of my All Things Crime episodes, and he was talking about, and this is a guy that's been out, investigated hundreds of murders, and he said the ones that you always remember are the kids. And
Yes,
he said, yeah, there's nothing worse than seeing a child victim, and it's just absolutely incredible. And so you think about in that context, you know, in a sense, the detectives and the crime scene investigators that have to actually investigate something like that, they're victims too. That's why the PTSD and things like that are so prevalent in, and I shouldn't say hugely prevalent, but there's a lot more PTSD.
Yeah, definitely. And PTSD is terrible. I mean, I know I've experienced it myself, not from that, but just from other traumas. So I do understand.
Yeah. And there's a lot more than what people would think. And, you know, everybody's human, and everybody has frailties and areas of vulnerabilities, and being able to take those into consideration. It's all part of the overall scheme that has to be looked at, as well as the crime itself. And it's again, anywhere in the world, it's all the same, and everybody's affected by it. And many of us that are out here in society that are working different jobs, and we don't have anything to do with law enforcement, it still affects you. And if there's ever a major crime in your immediate community, and like in your neighborhood, for example, that affects you. And
of course, because it's really close to home.
Right. Yeah, there's I'll give you an example. In the neighborhood that I live in, I want to say 6-8 months ago, there was a van that was driving around, and the word was that this van would stop and talk to certain children. And so most of us know what that means.
Yes.
That there's a high probability that they're actually targeting children. Well,
yeah. Pedophilia, sex trafficking.
Right. So that word got around, and I live in a suburb of Salt Lake, and actually about 40 miles south of Salt Lake. And so it's a quiet little neighborhood, and you just don't think about those kind of things happening in a neighborhood like this, but it does. And when it does, the shockwave that goes through the entire community is just absolutely staggering. And so you magnify that, especially when you get into areas where crime is happening all the time. The trauma that those folks go through is just absolutely amazing. And so you have to take those things into consideration, and really, they have a different perspective than somebody that lives in a nice, quiet, safe neighborhood like me. And for me to say there is no crime, that's ridiculous.
Yeah, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
It's just greater or lesser in specific areas, but it still exists.
Oh, yeah. And the concept that there's no crime in your neighborhood, I don't care who you are.
Yeah.
If you believe that, you have your head in the sand, because there's always more crime. There's always more things going on than what you actually know. And it's not to make anybody super paranoid and start, locking themselves in their houses all day. But at the same time, we just live in a different world, and the information that flows is a fantastic thing, but it can also be a very dangerous thing.
Absolutely. And there's a very fine line.
Yes, absolutely. So I deal obviously on the physical side of evidence, but the things that people do physically, a lot of times they go through things mentally and emotionally far before they actually go through things physically. And so a lot of times the folks that I'm working with are working on the physical end once something really terrible has actually physically happened.
Mm.
But a lot of times that emotional and intellectual and spiritual scars can happen long before the physical. So
Yeah.
even working on those ends, again, we'll circle back to the communication. You know,
Yeah.
how are you communicating with your neighbors? How are you communicating with your community? You know, letting people know that they have a safe place to go, or a friend to talk to.
Yes.
You know, everybody can make a difference. And I think the more of us that get out of our little shell, get out of our own little world and our own little bubble, and actually reach out to our neighbors and say, hey, you know, if you need anything, I'm here. You know, just that could make a difference in somebody's life.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, we obviously did touch on that you were in the Army for 14 years, or you served for the US Army for 14 years. So what was it like for you, and how was the transition from moving into forensics and CSI and the development of technology? And was this an organic process for you, or was this a challenge? And having served, do you believe this helped you and give you an advantage, or was it a challenge?
So my military transitioning,
transitioning
out of the
military to doing what you do now, was it an organic process for you, or was it a challenge?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, the interesting thing about the military is it has an extreme structure every day that everybody fits into, and the routine's very similar. The rank structure is very, very established, and so it's I don't want to say rigid, but at the same time, everybody knows what's happening, and unless
and what
something really bad
supposed to be doing.
Right. Well, transitioning out of that, you lose a lot of that structure, and I think that's one of the things that military folks struggle with the most. I was fortunate that in the military, my primary job responsibilities were nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare. But the core of that is understanding chemistry and biology and nuclear, which includes, in a sense, DNA. And so everything that I was doing had that line through it. Now the structure changed because I went from being in a very structured environment to one, especially once I got into the sales, there's almost no structure. It's almost completely set by the person. And so I went from having everything set to what I was doing every day to, or at least having, you know, unit goals that I was contributing to accomplishing, but that was very structured. And moving into sales jobs where basically every day I set my own agenda, and it was completely different. So that part of it took a little bit to getting used to, but I was fortunate enough that I went into various sales jobs that had a biology or a chemistry structure, especially once I got into pharmaceuticals. So I had that string, and a lot of people do that. Like if they're a mechanic in the military, oftentimes they'll go into being a mechanic in the civilian world. And so there's that little line that familiarity that they will maintain.
Yes.
And so having that background definitely helped me once I got involved with MVAC systems, because not only did we, you know, at the beginning, because the MVAC is capable of collecting biowarfare type of agents, including like anthrax and things like that. So I was marketing a little bit to the military, but at the same time, that biology and chemistry background all made sense to me. And especially once we got into forensics, then there's a lot of things that I rely on that I learned in the military that I apply now as a person that markets to the forensics world.
Yes. Well, that makes sense. So what are the 3 key pieces of advice you would give to others looking to pursue a similar career in forensics and law enforcement? And do you believe that the diversification of developing technology has given you an advantage? And what do you think separated you from others in your field? So I know it's a lot, sorry.
Yeah, well, that was packed. Well, let's see. There's always going to be things where you fit and where you don't fit.
Yes.
And I would say the number one thing is when you're looking at, for example, the forensics industry, well, it doesn't really matter what industry you're looking at. Go into it with enough open-mindedness that you're actually looking at it and how you fit, as well as, is it a job? I know in having been unemployed at different times, you know, I've never been unemployed for very long, but when you are in that position and you're worried about providing for your family and things, then any job will matter. But if you're not in a position that it's you feel it's just natural and it's a perfect fit, then don't be afraid to change. And I think that's one of the problems with some people, that they'll get into an occupation, they know it's not really a good fit, and it's more than just that initial learning the basics of it. You know, there's always going to be a little bit of being uncomfortable when you first start at any job, but yeah, or any career or any new business or anything. There's always a big learning curve. But once you get in, you've got the basics down, then really stand back and evaluate it and say, is this actually a good fit for me and what I'm pursuing? And I think the fear of change and the discomfort of change and the thought of starting over again, that's one of the things that locks people into areas that they don't necessarily want to be in. And to me, that leads to misery. And
yeah, very much so.
Yeah, I think I'm a perfect example of that, because as much as I loved the military, as much as I loved, rappelling out of helicopters and these big exercises and doing all this fun stuff that I used to do in the Army, one of my primary inputs was my family. And ultimately, I had to make the decision because it just wasn't a good fit for me. Now, for many people, it's the perfect fit. And yes, that's how they are able to be career soldiers. And I tell you, my hat's off to them, because they are absolutely amazing people in being able to do that. But on the same sense, they look at guys like me and they're like, you're out of your mind. Are you kidding? Doing a small business? There's nothing more miserable than being the owner of a small business, especially right now. I mean, there's so many people that are struggling so bad.
Yes.
And it's because they just don't have the revenues. You know, small businesses don't have millions of dollars to sit back on during COVID and different emergencies like this. And so being a small business owner has its own challenges. And there's many people that'll look at a small business owner and they say, you're out of your mind. But there's benefits, and there's places where people will fit, and there's places where you won't. And if it's not a good fit, then be open enough to admit that, number one, and then to say, you know what, I'm going to stay where I'm at long enough to find something where I am a better fit. Because again, finding the place where you actually fit, where you benefit the most, both to yourself and to your employer if you work for somebody, or to your own business if you start your own business, that's the key to everything. And
yeah, 100%. So that leads me to the last question. What legacy would you like to leave, or how would you like to be remembered?
Wow. That's a deep philosophical question right there, isn't it?
It's not a question that's easy to answer. Like, if you have to answer it yourself, it's easier to ask it than answer it.
Of course. How do I want to be remembered? Well, I think everybody has the same goal there, honestly. You want to be remembered as a good person, a good dad or a good mom, and so of course that's my own goal. I have 5 kids, and I want all of my kids to know how much I love them. I want all of my family to know how important they are to me.
Yeah.
I want the business community to look at me and say, yeah, he did it right. I think that's everybody's goal, but
Yeah.
how we accomplish it, of course, is going to be the challenge.
Always.
Right. I think ultimately though, well, I don't want to get, I need to be careful here so I don't get overly emotional here, but
Yeah.
my dad passed away in 2009.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, you don't really recognize how amazing your parents are until they're gone. And so just as a side note, I would tell everybody out there to spend as much time as you can with your parents, because and show them how much you love them, because one day all of a sudden they'll be gone. And at my dad's funeral, I could not believe how many people walked up to me and said, your dad, because my dad, when I was growing up in Idaho, my dad served as a scoutmaster for, I don't know, 20 years. And he did that on top of being a small business owner and, you know, working with the dairy industry and then developing the MVAC. He did, and he still, all the time that I remember growing up as a kid, he was my scoutmaster. And so going out on camping trips and, you know, working with kids and developing their fire building skills and communication skills and all those kind of things, he devoted an amazing amount of time for that. And so at his funeral, there had to have been, 50, 70 guys walk up to me, some of them older than me, some of them a little bit younger, but all kind of in my generation. And they were all like, you know what, your dad was my scoutmaster, and he was the one that helped me through a really tough period of my life where I was a rebellious teenager. And if it hadn't been for your dad, you know, who knows where I'd be right now.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That speaks volumes.
So to live up to that kind of a legacy, I can't think of anything better. It's to know that I did it right enough that my dad would be proud of me. There you go.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jared. I really appreciate it, and hopefully we can have you back in the future to see where you are and how your journeys progress. And if people want to connect with you, what are the best platforms to do so?
Well, LinkedIn for sure, which is pretty sure where we met. I think my profile is Jared V. Bradley on LinkedIn, and I'd love to connect with anybody there. There's the relationships that I'm starting to build on LinkedIn, I think, are so much deeper and more meaningful than the other social media platforms. Yeah. If you want to learn about the MVAC, there's two ways to do it, really. You could go to our website, which is m-vac, as in vacuum, so m-vac.com. And then for sure, subscribe to our All Things Crime YouTube channel, and I'm going to be converting that into a podcast as well. And yeah, I'd love to connect with anybody else out there.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and we'll definitely have you back in the future.
Oh, it's been an absolute pleasure, and I appreciate you having me on.